Something serious is about to hit America, something not born in a moment, but cultivated through decades of negligence, deception, and strategic erosion. What approaches is not a sudden catastrophe, but a convergence, a culmination of forces that have long been in motion. This is not just about politics or the economy or the environment. It is about the soul of a nation, the fabric of a society, and the future of a people who have been led to believe they are free, even as the walls quietly close in. We must begin with an honest recognition the system has been rigged, not recently, not suddenly, but methodically, through policy, ideology, and silence. Power has concentrated in the hands of the few, while the many are distracted, divided, and demoralized. The illusion of democracy persists, but the substance has been hollowed out. Elections take place, yes, but real choices have grown narrower. The debates rage on, but the most urgent questions, those about class, empire, and justice, are buried under noise. This is not a condemnation of the American people, quite the opposite. It is an affirmation of their dignity, a call to awaken that latent power still resting in the hands of the many. Because what is coming will test every foundation, every institution, every assumption we hold about who we are and what we stand for. The cracks are already visible in the housing crisis, in student debt, in the militarized policing of impoverished communities, in the grotesque inequities of healthcare and education. These are not isolated failures. They are systemic symptoms. What looms on the horizon is not merely economic collapse or political unrest. Those may come, but they are byproducts. What's truly at stake is something deeper, an existential reckoning with the moral architecture of a nation. Can a society built on conquest, extraction, and domination transform itself into one rooted in equity, sustainability, and truth? That is the defining question of our era, and the answer will not come from those in power. It must come from below. The machinery of propaganda has long told Americans that they are exceptional. It's a seductive lie. It allows the nation to justify wars abroad, surveillance at home, and obscene levels of inequality as the natural order of things. But history has not been erased. The brutality of slavery, the dispossession of native peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, these are not distant shadows. They are living structures embedded in the present. The system has not moved past these injustices. It has evolved to accommodate them in more subtle and insidious forms, and now the bill is coming due. The climate is collapsing. The gap between rich and poor has become a chasm. The institutions once trusted to mediate conflict, courts, media, even education, have been weaponized or rendered impotent. In such a moment, despair is understandable, but it is not sufficient. Despair, while seductive, serves only to perpetuate the status quo. What is required now is clarity, courage, and commitment. Clarity to see the system for what it is, not as a series of unfortunate events, but as a design. This design prioritizes profit over people, consumption over consciousness, and domination over dialogue. The role of the citizen is reduced to that of a consumer or spectator. Meanwhile, the architects of empire and industry operate in shadows, largely unaccountable, insulated by wealth and legal privilege. Courage to speak the truth, especially when it's unpopular, to say that capitalism as we know it is unsustainable, that American foreign policy is, in many cases, imperialism by another name, that corporate media does not inform, it pacifies, that the so-called middle-class dream is increasingly a myth, sustained only by debt and distraction. Truth, telling in such a climate, is not merely brave, it is revolutionary, and commitment to act, not only in protest but in creation. It is not enough to tear down, we must also build alternative economies, participatory politics, education that liberates rather than indoctrinates, communities grounded in solidarity, not suspicion. This is not a utopian fantasy, it is a necessity, because if we do not imagine and build another world, the one bearing down upon us will be shaped entirely by those who profit from our ignorance. Something serious is indeed about to hit America, but its impact depends not only on the crisis itself, but on our collective response. Will we continue to look away, hoping the storm will pass? Or will we rise, awkwardly, painfully, but decisively, to meet this moment with the full weight of our humanity? There is no savior coming from the top. History teaches this again and again. Real change has always come from the margins, from the poor, the organized, the defiant. It was never the senators who ended segregation, nor the CEO who stopped child labor. It was the people. It still is. Every right we cherish was born out of struggle, and every time we forget that, we grow more vulnerable to losing it all. America is not in the midst of a temporary disruption. It is standing on the edge of a profound systemic crisis, the kind that does not simply shake institutions, but challenges the very core of a nation's identity. This is not the result of a single decision or administration. It is the culmination of decades, generations of structural decay, moral evasion, and collective denial. The storm that approaches is not a natural disaster. It is man-made, it is political, economic, and deeply spiritual, and it has been allowed to gather strength while most were looking the other way. This crisis did not begin in the headlines of recent years. It did not start with a market crash, a pandemic, or a presidential scandal. Its roots go back much further, to trade deals that deindustrialized communities, to wars fought under false pretenses, to austerity measures that hollowed out public institutions, and to a media culture that replaced awareness with distraction. Layer by layer, the foundations of solidarity and justice were dismantled, replaced with individualism, consumerism, and fear. The economic structure, sold to the public as a pathway to prosperity, has in truth become a machine for upward wealth transfer. Workers are told to work harder while the wealth they create flows upward to the billionaire class. Entire communities are sacrificed for quarterly profits. Education becomes a commodity. Healthcare becomes a luxury. Housing becomes speculative capital, and the most basic human needs are auctioned off in the marketplace as if they were optional. Meanwhile, the political system, long celebrated as a beacon of democracy, now serves primarily to entrench power. The illusion of choice is maintained, but the spectrum of acceptable ideas has narrowed so dramatically that real dissent is either co-opted or silenced. Lobbyists write legislation, corporations fund campaigns, and the voices of ordinary people are drowned in the noise of polished rhetoric and hollow promises. It is not democracy when money rules and truth is optional, but the crisis extends beyond policy. It reaches into the very spirit of the nation. There is a spiritual impoverishment, a moral fatigue that cannot be measured by GDP or polls. A society that teaches competition over compassion, appearance over authenticity, and conquest over cooperation is one that is losing its soul. The wounds are not just economic. They are existential. People feel it in the anxiety that never leaves, in the isolation that haunts even crowded rooms, in the despair that numbs even the young. The system that dominates now thrives on disconnection. It wants citizens fragmented, suspicious of one another, too exhausted to organize and too distracted to think. It offers empty entertainment instead of knowledge, consumption instead of community, and survival instead of dignity. Yet beneath the surface, something ancient and powerful still stirs, the human hunger for meaning, for justice, for belonging. That hunger cannot be forever suppressed. To face this crisis honestly is to reject the soothing lies that have allowed it to grow. It means acknowledging that this is not a series of bad outcomes. It is the intended result of a structure built on profit, control, and exclusion. And while that may seem daunting, it is also liberating. Because once we see clearly, we are no longer bound by illusions, we are free to imagine and fight for another way of living. The crisis is real, but so is the possibility of renewal. And as we look deeper into the roots of this unraveling, we must begin to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we wish to leave behind? What are we willing to build in its place, and perhaps most urgently, what must we do together before it's too late? The answers to those questions begin to take shape as we examine the next dimension of this unfolding reality. Many still believe they live in a democracy because they can vote, speak freely, and criticize authority without immediate retribution. And yet, beneath these surface freedoms lies a sobering truth. The machinery of real decision-making, the levers of economic and political power, are tightly gripped by an elite minority. Elections are held. Speeches are given, debates are televised, but the outcomes that shape daily life, the distribution of wealth, the direction of foreign policy, the protection of corporate privilege remain remarkably consistent no matter which party is in power. This is not an accident, it is the architecture of illusion. The system survives by convincing people that they have influence while ensuring that their influence never threatens the core structure of power. Voters are given a choice between candidates pre-approved by donors and consultants, policies with overwhelming public support, like universal health care, debt relief, or climate action, are routinely shelved or diluted in service to lobbyists and shareholders. Participation has been reduced to periodic rituals, while the real business of governance happens behind closed doors. What was once the public square has become a corporate stage. The media, once imagined as the guardian of truth, has become largely a tool for distraction or division. Outrage replaces inquiry, sensationalism drowns out substance, and the people, fed on sound bites and spectacle, are left disoriented, angry, yes, but unsure of where to direct their anger. In such a climate, it becomes easier to blame one another than to question the system itself. This is by design. The true function of this illusion is not merely to mislead, it is to pacify. When people believe they are free, they are less likely to resist. When they think their voices matter, they are less inclined to organize. And when they see change as only possible through the next election cycle, they become trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment, never realizing that the real battleground lies far beyond the voting booth. It lies in the streets, in the schools, in the workplaces, and in the collective imagination of a people who are beginning to awaken. There is no shame in having believed the illusion. The deception has been powerful and pervasive. From childhood, we are taught a sanitized story about governance and freedom, one that omits the long history of suppression, resistance, and unfinished struggle. But there comes a moment when the veil begins to lift, when the stories no longer match the reality people experience, and when the yearning for something real outweighs the comfort of falsehoods. That moment is upon us. In this moment, spiritual clarity becomes essential, for this is not only a political awakening, it is a moral and existential one. It forces us to confront the question, what does it mean to be truly free? Is it enough to have the right to speak if no one in power is listening? Is it enough to vote if the outcomes never reflect the will of the people? Is it enough to protest if the laws are written to ignore those protests? Freedom cannot live on appearances alone. It must be rooted in truth, justice, and accountability. Yet this clarity is not meant to lead to despair. It is meant to ignite action. Once we recognize that the emperor has no clothes, we are no longer bound by the rules of pretense. We are free to organize outside the accepted frameworks, to build new forms of community, and to reimagine power not as something hoarded from above, but shared from below. The collapse of the illusion does not weaken the people, it empowers them. For when the spell is broken, the real work can begin. And that work begins as we peel back another layer of this crisis. The realization that injustice is not a bug in the system, but a core feature. We must now examine how inequality, exploitation, and oppression are not merely tolerated by the system, but essential to its function. There is a painful but necessary truth that must be spoken. The injustice that defines so much of American life is not a mistake. It is not the consequence of poor management or unfortunate oversight. It is the product of design, a design that has evolved, adapted, and masked itself through language, law, and culture, but a design nonetheless. The growing divide between wealth and poverty, the racialized structure of opportunity and punishment, the destruction of the natural world, these are not random, they are built into the very architecture of the system. One cannot understand inequality without understanding power, and power, in its modern form, depends on hierarchy. For a small group to possess immense control, others must be rendered voiceless or invisible. Economic systems are carefully arranged so that profit flows upward while risk and suffering trickle down. Communities of color are disproportionately targeted by policing, environmental toxins, and disinvestment, not because the system fails them, but because it was never built to serve them in the first place. What some experience as dysfunction, others experience as a blueprint working exactly as intended. We must reject the comforting lie that the system is neutral. It is not. It has never been. From the founding of the nation, which enshrined slavery in law, to the redlining and segregation of the 20th century, to the mass incarceration and wage stagnation of today, the arc has been consistent. Policies are crafted not in ignorance of their outcomes, but often in anticipation of them, and the justification is always dressed in the language of necessity, security, or growth. But beneath that language lies a brutal logic: sacrifice the many for the wealth of the few. This sacrifice is not limited to human lives. The planet itself is a casualty of this design. The same economic logic that permits the exploitation of workers also permits the cutting of forests, the poisoning of rivers, and the warming of the atmosphere. Nature, like labor, is treated as expendable, and those most affected by ecological collapse, indigenous peoples, rural workers, and the urban poor are, again, the ones least protected, least heard, and least prioritized. The system is intersectional in its cruelty, yet to recognize that injustice is designed is not to declare defeat. It is to declare clarity, because what has been designed can be dismantled. What has been normalized can be exposed, and what has been imposed from above can be confronted from below. There is great power in naming the truth, for when people stop blaming themselves for their suffering, when they stop seeing poverty as personal failure or oppression as isolated misfortune, they begin to rise with shared purpose. This is the spiritual reawakening of solidarity, the rediscovery of the truth that our destinies are not separate. The system may tell us otherwise. It may pit worker against worker, neighbor against neighbor, race against race. But this, too, is part of the design: divide and conquer. The antidote to this is not more hatred or suspicion. It is radical compassion, radical truth, and radical unity. When people begin to see that their pain is not unique but systemic, the spark of collective resistance is born. It is not enough to protest the outcomes of the system. We must challenge its very foundation. That requires more than policy reform. It requires a cultural and moral transformation. It requires lifting the veil from our eyes and seeing that exploitation is not accidental. It is organized. It is embedded in tax codes, zoning laws, immigration policies, media narratives, and historical memory. It must be rooted out in every space it hides and replaced with systems rooted in justice, dignity, and care. And this work begins by tracing how these injustices are protected, not just by power, but by narrative. The next layer to explore is the myth of exceptionalism, the ideological armor that shields empire and inequality from scrutiny. We must now turn our attention to how this myth has blinded a people and enabled a state to do, abroad and at home, what would otherwise be unconscionable. Every empire tells a story about itself, and perhaps no empire has spun a more seductive tale than the one told by the United States. It is a myth carefully constructed over centuries, a story of freedom, opportunity, moral courage, and divine favor. This mythology claims that the nation is not just a country, but an idea, unique, chosen, and righteous in its mission. But myths, when left unchallenged, become prisons. They bind a people to illusions, even as the ground beneath them gives way. The myth of exceptionalism serves a specific purpose, to obscure contradiction. It allows a society that has perpetuated slavery, genocide, segregation, and endless war to still claim moral superiority. It enables policies that devastate communities abroad while insisting they are acts of liberation. It cloaks systemic racism, economic exploitation, and environmental collapse in the language of progress. It convinces people to see violence as virtue, to see suffering as someone else's fault, and to see empire as benevolence. This story is powerful not because it is true, but because it has been repeated relentlessly in textbooks, films, speeches, and ceremonies. Children grow up pledging allegiance to a flag before they understand the meaning of allegiance. Citizens are taught to equate patriotism with obedience, dissent with disloyalty, and criticism with betrayal. The myth demands not just belief, it demands silence in the face of contradiction, and that silence has cost the world dearly. The most dangerous myths are not those told by tyrants, but those we tell ourselves. When a society believes it is the greatest in history, it becomes blind to its own failings. When it believes it is always on the side of justice, it stops listening to the cries of its victims. When it believes it is immune to collapse, it ignores the warning signs until it is too late. Exceptionalism is not just a lie, it is a spiritual poison. It numbs conscience, it fosters arrogance, and it disables the capacity for self-reflection. But the truth, when spoken with courage, can heal. America is not the worst nation, nor the best. It is a nation like all others, built by human hands, capable of great beauty and deep cruelty. To love this country, truly love it, is to reject the myth and embrace the struggle to make it better. It is to acknowledge the horrors of its past, the injustices of its present, and the possibilities of a transformed future. Real patriotism does not mean pride without reflection. It means responsibility without denial. This moment in history demands a new kind of honesty, one that does not flinch from uncomfortable truths. It demands that we reckon with the full weight of history, not to drown in guilt, but to rise in clarity. For only when the myth is broken can new stories begin, stories rooted in humility, solidarity, and shared humanity. The myth has served the powerful long enough. It is time to serve the truth. Breaking free of this narrative does not make us weaker, it makes us stronger. It prepares us for the difficult work of dismantling empire and building justice. It prepares us to see other nations not as threats or inferiors, but as fellow travelers in the shared project of survival and dignity. And it prepares us to turn inward, to confront the decaying structures within our own borders that the myth has allowed us to ignore for too long. This internal reckoning is critical because as myths crumble, the foundations of daily life begin to tremble. What was hidden becomes visible. What was accepted becomes intolerable, and so we must now shift our focus to the reality that no savior is coming from above, and that real change must come, as it always has, from below. It is one of the most persistent and damaging illusions of our time that change will come from the top, that if we elect the right leaders, wait for the right moment, or trust the right institutions, justice will trickle down and liberation will arrive. But history teaches otherwise. Real transformation, the kind that reshapes societies, rights wrongs, and lifts up the forgotten, has never been granted from above. It has always been demanded from below. Political elites do not dismantle the structures that give them power. Corporate leaders do not volunteer to redistribute wealth. Institutions built to protect privilege do not willingly open their doors to the marginalized. That kind of change does not happen by permission. It happens through struggle, through sacrifice, through the collective refusal of ordinary people to accept the unacceptable any longer. It was not presidents or senators who ended segregation, who won labor protections, or who fought for women's rights. It was workers, students, mothers, immigrants, artists, and visionaries, many of them nameless to history, who rose together when it was neither safe nor convenient. They did not wait for permission. They acted from conscience, and in doing so, they revealed where the real power always resides, with the people. There is a sacred energy that lives in collective action. When people come together, not just to protest what is wrong, but to build what is right, they awaken something ancient and unstoppable. It is not chaos, it is not destruction, it is creation. It is the force that has always driven human progress, the refusal to let injustice harden into fate. Every movement that has shaped the arc of moral history has begun this way, with courage, with truth, and with unity from below. Yet the dominant culture works tirelessly to suppress this truth. We are taught to believe that power is something distant and reserved for the few, that politics is too complex, that movements are dangerous, that nothing we do can really make a difference. These are not harmless ideas. They are weapons. Weapons meant to keep people passive, divided, and disempowered. But when that lie is exposed, when people discover their capacity to shape the world, the ground begins to shift. This is why those in power fear organized movements more than anything else, not because they are violent, but because they are visionary. They challenge the terms of debate. They refuse to accept crumbs. They build alliances across lines of race, class, and geography. They name what others will not. And they carry forward the memory of past struggles, reminding us that we are not the first to face impossible odds, and we will not be the last to overcome them. Change from below is not instant, nor is it easy. It requires discipline, imagination, and resilience. It requires people to believe in something greater than themselves, but it is the only kind of change that lasts, because it is rooted not in the decisions of the powerful, but in the awakening of the many. That awakening is already beginning. It stirs in every strike, every march, every mutual aid network, every truth spoken out loud in defiance of silence. And as that awakening grows, so too does the opportunity to reimagine the structures of society itself. We must now turn our attention to the deeper possibilities that emerge when systems begin to collapse, not just the dangers, but the chances to create something new, something just, something rooted in the dignity of all. Collapse, though terrifying, is not the end. It is the cracking open of something long calcified, the breaking of an illusion that could no longer hold under its own weight. When systems built on greed, oppression, and deceit begin to fall apart, we are left with something rare, a chance. A chance to do more than just survive, to rethink, to rebuild, to reimagine. In those moments when old orders unravel, space is created for what was once impossible to become inevitable. Every empire that has collapsed has left behind not just ruins, but seeds. Seeds of renewal, of creativity, of shared purpose. Those who suffer most under the old system often become the visionaries of the new. This is not wishful thinking. It is the pattern of history. From the ashes of exploitation have risen movements for justice. From the void left by corrupt institutions, new forms of collective care have emerged. Pain and possibility are often born in the same breath. It is in the cracks of the dominant order that light begins to enter. When the center no longer holds, the margins are no longer silent. People who were once unseen begin to speak. Ideas once mocked begin to take root. What yesterday was called naive becomes tomorrow's common sense. And it is in these moments that people discover a truth deeper than fear. We were never powerless. We were only told we were. In the face of collapse, we are invited to choose, not between left and right, or between parties and personalities, but between old ways of being and new ones. Do we cling to the familiar out of fear, or do we take the risk of becoming something better? Do we mourn only what has died, or do we give birth to what is waiting to be born? This is the spiritual threshold of our time. Not a time for retreat, but a time for transformation. We are not starting from nothing. All around us are the beginnings of another world. Mutual aid networks feeding neighbors when systems fail. Worker cooperatives challenging exploitative models. Indigenous movements reminding us how to live in balance with the earth. Communities building solidarity across borders, languages, and lines of division. These are not fringe efforts. They are glimpses of the future struggling to be born through the fractures of the present. If we are willing to listen, we will hear the voices of the future calling us toward responsibility, humility, and imagination. Not everything must collapse for change to begin, but when collapse comes, it clarifies what matters most. It strips away pretense. It forces us to ask who we truly are, what we truly value, and what we are willing to fight for. Out of the rubble, we can build not just new structures, but a new consciousness, a deeper commitment to each other and to life itself. To embrace opportunity within collapse is not to minimize the suffering it brings. We must grieve the loss of what has failed. We must mourn what has been taken, but we must not let sorrow become paralysis. Grief, too, can be a gateway. If honored, it can sharpen our moral vision and deepen our resolve. We do not escape collapse by ignoring it. We transcend it by meeting it fully, with eyes open, hands joined, and hearts awakened. And in that awakening lies a new kind of hope, not blind optimism, but courageous determination. A hope that refuses to wait for permission. A hope that builds, that organizes, that refuses to settle for anything less than dignity and justice for all. And this brings us to the core of what must now emerge, a moral and political awakening powerful enough to match the scale of the crisis we face. At a time when everything seems to be unraveling, what is needed most is not a return to normal, but a conscious awakening. The crisis we face is not just political, not just economic, not just environmental. It is a crisis of spirit, of imagination, and of moral responsibility. We are being called, not gently but urgently, to rise from apathy, to shake off the sleep of indifference, and to become something more than bystanders in a collapsing world. This is the hour of reckoning, and it demands clarity, courage, and commitment from all of us. Clarity, because we must see what is real, not what we wish were true, not what we are told to believe, but what the evidence, the experience, and the truth of our communities make undeniably clear. We cannot afford to remain confused or numb. The systems in place are not broken, they are working exactly as they were designed to work, and they are destroying lives, livelihoods, and the living planet in the process. Seeing clearly is the first act of liberation. Courage, because the truth, once seen, requires action. It is no longer enough to lament injustice. It is no longer sufficient to say we care. We are being asked to step into discomfort, into uncertainty, into confrontation with forces that do not yield easily. But the courage we need is not the courage of the heroic few. It is the collective courage of everyday people who, in solidarity, discover they are more powerful than they had been led to believe. Commitment, because this moment cannot be met with fleeting outrage or seasonal resistance. The changes that must occur will take time, sacrifice, and deep-rooted resilience. The journey ahead will not be paved with instant victories. It will require us to show up again and again for each other, for truth, for justice, and for future generations. Commitment means knowing we may not see the full fruits of our labor, but planting the seeds anyway. This awakening is not about ideology. It is not owned by any party or flag. It is about reclaiming what it means to be human in a system that has tried to reduce us to numbers, to consumers, to cogs in a machine. It is about reconnecting to values that transcend profit and power: compassion, interdependence, mutual care, and reverence for life itself. These values are not naive. They are essential if we are to survive what is coming and shape what comes after. We are standing at a precipice. On one side lies the continuation of a path that leads to deeper inequality, ecological collapse, authoritarianism, and despair. On the other side lies a different road, not easier but filled with possibility. It is the road of collective renewal, of people deciding that the future will not be written by elites in boardrooms or war rooms, but by communities, workers, teachers, healers, artists, and visionaries who choose life over profit and justice over convenience. To walk this road requires more than information. It requires transformation. We must move beyond outrage and into organized, conscious resistance. We must move beyond temporary activism and into sustained movement, building. We must move beyond waiting for someone else to lead and recognize that we are the ones we have been waiting for. The awakening has already begun, but it must spread further, deeper, and faster if it is to meet the scale of the hour. And so the question now is not whether something serious is coming. It is already here. The real question is, how will we respond? Will we retreat into fear or step forward into responsibility? Will we repeat the mistakes of the past, or will we be bold enough to chart a new course, one that leads toward liberation, not just for some, but for all? This question opens the door to what comes next. And let us speak honestly about the economic model we've accepted for far too long, a model that rewards destruction, externalizes costs, and treats the planet as an infinite resource. This model is not broken. It is working exactly as designed. What's broken is our willingness to believe that this is the only way, that we must accept scarcity in the midst of abundance, homelessness in the midst of vacant luxury towers, hunger in a land that throws away food by the ton. The future is not something to be awaited. It is being shaped now in real time by the choices we make or fail to make. The next generation will not inherit a stable democracy or a livable planet unless we earn it for them. And that begins with unlearning the myths we've been taught, that freedom means consumption, that dissent is disloyalty, that inequality is natural. These lies have run their course. The consequences are here. But so, too, is the opportunity, because when systems fail, they also open. Cracks emerge where light can enter. People who were silent begin to speak. Ideas once ridiculed become common sense, and movements long dismissed as fringe become the moral compass of the age. We are in such a moment now, a rupture, a reckoning, a choice. So let us choose not comfort, but conscience, not convenience, but courage, not the shallow victories of partisan tribalism, but the deeper transformation of collective awakening. That is how serious this moment is, and that is how serious we must become in response.